last Little Caesar scene before Homeboy Blue. Drop some old on each one of you. Your father. JC was your brother, and JC was your brother. And what I want to know, when comes such another great Caesar's ghost? A great Caesar's ghost. He's chilly low from coast to coast. A great Caesar's ghost. A great Caesar's ghost.
She's an actress from Europe.
State agent and property owner named Edward Amos has been renting out houses all over Brisbane. A dozen of the houses he rents are his own properties, most of them run down and decrepit. In 1980, the Auctioneers and Agents Committee took away Mr. Amos's agent's licence for 6 months after finding him to be not a fit and proper person to hold a licence. But apart from that, Mr. Amos has operated pretty well how he's wanted over the years, using a variety of techniques and excuses to avoid making repairs to his properties and to avoid repaying bonds and other monies when his tenants moved out. Michelle Bond came across one of Mr. Amos's more bizarre ways of retaining money after she rented a Clayfield home from him in 1982. When Mr. Amos refused to return the money she'd paid in advance, she took him to the Small Claims Tribunal.
Well, he said that I was using the house for immoral purposes and that criminals were coming and going.
Despite his claim, the tribunal ordered Mr. Amos's company to refund Michelle $300. Mr. Amos then produced his trump card. Under Special Condition 15 of the lease, one of the most extraordinary conditions in renting history, the tenant agrees to pay the landlord's legal expenses on demand, including any arising from a decision of the Small Claims Tribunal. Mr. Amos wrote that he would take the matter of the $300 to the Supreme Court and she would be liable for legal expenses totalling several $1,000s. Michelle got the message, Mr. Amos kept the money. Another method Mr. Amos used to retain money was to charge premiums, a form of key money that's non-returnable. Something Linda Lomax found out when she and her 5 children moved out of one of Mr. Amos's houses in Northgate. When Linda asked for the bond back, Mr. Amos told her the ad for the house had said premium. Did you understand what he meant by premium?
No, I just thought it was a bond.
So when you paid the money, he didn't tell you it was non-refundable or anything like that?
No, nothing at all like that.
Do you remember seeing anything about a premium in the lease?
When I went to read the lease, he said, oh, come on, I haven't got time for you to do that. He said, I've made a special trip down here on Saturday morning for you to sign up. So I haven't got time to wait for you to read the lease. So he just signed it up.
Mr. Amos tells us he no longer uses Special Condition 15 and no longer charges premiums because he says tenants have more incentive to maintain his properties if there's a bond they can get back. He denies that he stopped charging them because of a series of orders from the Small Claims Tribunal against him or his company to repay the so-called premiums, generally because the tenants believe them to be bonds. Altogether, the tribunal has made 11 orders in favour of former tenants of Mr. Amos seeking return of monies. But there's no shortage of people still in dispute with him about bonds, like Janet Delaney, who rented this Ascot house with her sister Rachel last January. 3 days later, Mr. Amos wrote suggesting Janet vacate after she threatened to complain to the health authorities unless he carried out repairs.
It was a pigsty. I mean, we couldn't have moved into it until we cleaned it.
But it was cleaning the house in that short time that led them to lose the bond.
We took the cabs up, we asked his permission to remove the floor coverings as they smelled of animal excretion. He gave that permission. The tiles on the kitchen floor just sort of crumpled as we tried to scrub them. So they ended up, most of them were removed. Wallpaper fell off the lounge room wall as we were cleaning.
Well, when you moved out, what excuse did he give for not paying back all the rent you paid in advance and all the bond money?
Our so-called damages to the house, which was the wallpaper and the floor coverings.
Janet tried to take the matter to the Small Claims Tribunal, but the day before it was due to be heard, Mr. Amos countersued her in the Magistrates' Court for damage to the tiles, wallpaper and carpet. Trying to take action to get your money back when you leave one of these houses can be a very difficult affair. Well, the first problem is who do you try to get the money from? Now, Mr. Amos goes out of his way to prevent tenants knowing that he's the owner. He pretends to be nothing more than the real estate agent. Something Anne Lothian found out when she asked Mr. Amos to carry out repairs.
The back stairs was falling off, you know, like every time you walk down the stairs they would wobble. You know, you'd be sure that, you know, you'd fall down. And when you shut the front door, the whole house shook. Yeah.
So did you ask him to repair these things?
Yeah, we did, several times.
And what did you say?
He just said no, because he's not the landlord. He doesn't own the house. Other people do. And he's asked them and they said no.
Janet Delaney tells the same story.
The only thing he said to us was the owner wouldn't do any major repairs. He didn't want to spend any money on it.
You didn't realise that he was talking about himself?
I didn't. He obviously knew what he was saying.
Now, Mr Ramos himself would seem to be quite well off. He owns and lives in this house in Clayfield. He owns and rents the house next door. He owns properties all over Brisbane. But don't expect to get any money out of him, because he operates through companies. Now, put simply, he leases all the properties he owns to a shelf company which sublets them. Now, how does that protect him? Well, in 1985, for example, he was operating through a company called Property Renovations Proprietary Limited. And he'd structured the company in such a way that all the money it made, like rents, was paid straight to him. So if you sued, you'd have to sue Property Renovations. And if you won, you'd find Edward Amos as director, arguing that the company couldn't pay you anything because it had no assets and made no profits. And that's exactly what Mr Amos has argued at the Small Claims Tribunal. Mind you, he told the tribunal that the reason why he operated through a company was so he wouldn't be personally liable if, say, one of his houses burnt down and killed a tenant. Now, while none of Mr Amos's tenants have been killed, one man who was visiting a tenant tells us he broke his wrist when the staircase to the house collapsed under him. As for tenants, Mr Amos uses as-is clauses in leases to avoid having to repair anything other than major or dangerous faults. But the law doesn't always work to his advantage. In 1986, a magistrate, Don Farden, fined Mr Amos for trying to avoid a court order. He said he had considered bringing contempt of court charges against Mr Amos, but believed Mr Amos would, and I quote, find jail a source of pleasure as someone else would be supplying board and lodgings free of charge. Despite many approaches, Mr Amos, who occasionally appears at his office in Clayfield, has refused to be interviewed, saying he can't comment because of a number of legal actions he's mounting. However, he did volunteer by phone that he had always refunded bonds to people who were legally entitled to them, and that he did not hide the fact that he was the landlord. He told us some of his leases even said he was. He concluded by saying, "We're practically the Salvation Army." So there you go. Now, there is one glimmer of hope as far as this situation goes. Queensland is finally introducing a rental bond board later this year. While it won't arbitrate disputes, it will release bond money to tenants if the landlord is ordered to pay by the Small Claims Tribunal. Well, Mr Amos tells us he welcomes the introduction of the bond board, but let's hope there's no unscrupulous landlords out there who think up ways to get around it.
Despite the best alarms, the best precautions, stolen cars are still a fact of life. And sadly, well, this is where some of them end up. Now, most of us try to minimise the pain by keeping our vehicles insured, so that if the worst should happen, we're in the best position to either get the car back on the road or get into another quick smart. Either way, if you've been paying your premiums, you certainly don't expect to be disadvantaged. But a couple from Newcastle claim that their insurance company's decision to rebuild their wrecked car not only kept them waiting for more than 12 months, but has also effectively cost them thousands of dollars. Jeff and Val Sampson wanted a car with that little bit extra. They run 2 Newcastle travel agencies and liked the idea of a car that would be suitable if they needed to drive clients around. So 2 years ago, they settled on a luxury Holden Statesman de Ville with a price tag of $24,000. Now, they took care to fully insure the car and did so with this Newcastle-based company, Motor Accident Mutual Insurance Proprietary Limited. They'd had the car for less than a year when it was stolen, stripped and wrecked.
3 Swansea men appeared in Wallsend Court today on charges related to a car stealing racket. The charges follow the finding of cars worth more than $200,000 in bushland areas such as Freeman's Waterhole. They had been stripped of unidentifiable parts such as body panels.
But shocked as they were, the Sampsons figured that their comprehensive MAMI policy, with its premium of $435, would see them through and have the matter quickly resolved.
Well, we did think that the agreed value would be paid out in the first instance, because we didn't believe that the car would be a viable motor car again. But after about a week, we were informed that they had intended to rebuild it. And this was a bit of a shock, because all the electrics and everything have been ripped out, and it means that all those wires have got to be joined, and they're under the dash and out of sight. And it struck us that the car would not perhaps be reliable again after it had been rebuilt, even with the best intent. There was no redress at all. There was no one to whom we could appeal. That was the insurance company's decision, and they're right, and that's what they were doing.
Unhappy with the company's decision, but aware that there was little that they could do about it, the Sampsons waited for the job to be completed. And all up, it was almost 14 months before they finally got the car back. According to the repairers, Young and Green, there had been unavoidable delays with spare parts. Well, now they finally have the car back, another hitch has emerged, because the Statesman no longer has a compliance plate like this car here. Now, what this small metal plate tells us is the make and model of the car, the seating capacity, the date of manufacture, and the various Australian design rules that the car has been manufactured to comply with. According to the Sampsons, because their car was rebuilt without that plate, any resale value has effectively dropped by thousands.
I knew that the compliance plate had been taken along with the registration plates, but I didn't understand the significance that car dealers and those people buying cars put on this compliance plate, because without that there are only papers, and of course it notifies people, quite rightly so, that something has happened to the car, and the result is that half of the value of the car would go from, say, $25,000 down to something in the region of 12 to 15. If we were very, very lucky, it could be as low as 6.
General Manager of the NRMA, one of Australia's biggest car insurers, Mr. Richard Cox, agrees a missing compliance plate can cause problems.
Oh, the marketplace perceives it as being an identification plate, and for that reason they put a lot of credence to it. And that's why a lot of insurance companies are called upon to remove the compliance plate from total wrecks.
So what would happen in the mind of an average person who's out shopping for a car if they come upon a car that doesn't have a compliance plate?
I guess they'd be a little concerned of what the history of that car was.
And what would that do to the value?
Obviously it would lower the value of the car.